Alrighty, so if you missed the developer stream from today, you basically have missed out on all of the information that's going to be walking into Season 2 as far as it refers to like foundational and infrastructure-based systems in the game. We're talking about content that exists in the game, how players interact with that content, how the game is shaped and literally formed so that the player's game experience is good, and if you were to take everything and kind of catalog them according to going through the big list of stuff that they did and just, bring them back up to high-level concepts that are easy to refer to, you get 23 different things that are unique that they specifically changed or they're going to change in Season 2. And while this big list of stuff is fine, I'm going to very quickly go through it just in case people just literally want a bulleted list. I'm going to have timestamps down to everything below. So for the bird's eye view breakdown of the 23 different foundationally unique changes that are coming to the game, and I'm going to basically give like a 1 to 2 sentence breakdown of each of them. You can always go read the entirety of the blog post, which I'll have included in the link below, so you can just very quickly read it through yourself. I basically went through this and looked at every single bullet point and went, okay, is this a unique thing? Yep. Okay, let's go ahead and toss it into the list. The first big thing is that they've added 5 new endgame bosses. You're going to need to farm all of the different systems in the game to get materials to eventually summon them. The reason why the bosses exist is that they have individual loot tables for unique items and uber unique items when it comes to Duriel, the final unique boss here. And the concept is that these give you milestone approaches for character progression, allow you to get unique items that typically gated certain builds behind actually needing them to function, thinking Tempest Roar on the Druid and Ring of Mendeln on the Necromancer here, as well as being able to farm for specific cosmetic skins that will be available. They're in the Eternal Realm and in the Seasonal Realm, so everybody gets to participate with this system. It's obviously the biggest thing coming, and it really defines an entire new facet to the evolving and hopefully continuing to proliferate endgame of Diablo 4. Full Renown now carries over for your character, so if you've done all of the Renown, you never have to do it ever again. For people who like the checklist approach of Renown, being like, okay, I did these dungeons, etc., you kind of miss out on that, and it stinks, but most people just in general didn't like doing it, and I think that was more so a symptom of not all the systems necessarily being interesting to participate with, as opposed to Renown itself being inherently broken, but what can you do? There are a ton of changes coming to Nightmare Dungeons and how you interact with Nightmare Dungeons. And I'm just going to show you the blog post here because there's too many of them for me to very quickly highlight it, but I'll still try to go through it quickly. You're going to immediately teleport into a Nightmare Dungeon when you use a Nightmare Sigil. You're always going to get a Nightmare Dungeon whenever you complete a Nightmare Dungeon. Otherwise, you wouldn't always get it if it didn't have a boss at the end. Some Nightmare Dungeons that have bosses in them have all of their other objectives completely removed. You walk in, you kill monsters, then you go kill a boss. That's all you need to do. For other ones that still have objectives in it, all of them have been put along the primary path that takes you through the dungeon. And while other paths in the dungeon may continue to exist, those are purely for people who want to go farm them and are never going to need to get backtracked through, hopefully, to be able to progress to the end of the dungeon. If you just want to do the objectives and get to the dungeon, you should be able to do that without having to run through a bunch of hallways that lead to dead ends. They've changed a ton of the really high visibility and issue causing Nightmare Dungeon affixes. Backstabber and most notably Monster Critical Resist are actually going to be player skill based affixes that you interact with. When if you mess up, you're not just getting one shot or having all of your damage completely handicapped, you're going to have mounting negative impact from continuously failing to interact with these affixes. Well, with Backstab just applying vulnerable status and then increasing how much vulnerable damage you take, and Monster Critical Resist reducing how much critical damage you do when you are successfully hit by a monster. So if you literally just play better, these affixes effectively become free and are no longer just like complete no runs for most builds. Death Pulse will never overlap with another monster that has an on death effect, and on top of that, death pulses won't all overlap with each other. So you'll only spawn a death pulse if a death pulse isn't already there, most notably in like spider dungeons. While the little spiders all die, you're not just gonna get hit by 50 death pulses all at once. The Lightning Storm is actually kind of cool now, where if you jump into the bubble for the Lightning Storm, you're actually going to gain a large percentage of movement speed after it strikes. So it's not just strictly slowing you down. And then on top of that, it'll only ever proc if you're actively in combat, so not just while you're running through the dungeon trying to get to the next part. And then also it should only function if you have a direct line to it and never be like back around a door or corridor, or if you're climbing down like one of the ladders in the game and it goes off and it kills you when you get to the end of the ladder, which happened to me all of the time. So that's a pretty awesome change there. And then Drifting Shade isn't as punishing. One, it doesn't last on the ground as long, and two, it doesn't spawn as often. A ton of the dungeons supposedly have had their layouts redesigned, but we haven't really seen what that means. We only got one example where again, it just took the entrance to the primary objectives and then immediately led to the boss room and also blocked you off from running into the next part of the dungeon before completing the objectives. So you never like accidentally trailed off on that map and then ran around and be like, oh no, I needed to go all the way back, something like that. And then most notably for a lot of people is that Paragon Glyph XP has been increased in Nightmare Dungeons. So you're not going to have to always be running them all the time to perpetually be leveling up all your glyphs. You'll be able to do that much more quickly. Okay, I'm not going to go that in depth with the majority of other things because it's just too much stuff. Mounts are just better. They're not going to get stuck as much. You're going to be able to increase their run speed more often. Their minimum run speed is increased, so they're actually faster to walk around in town than like walking around innovating on a character. You're going to be able to jump over gaps a lot more easily. You're going to be able to burst through stockades as opposed to getting stopped by them. So just mounts in general across the entirety of the game are going to feel a lot better, meaning that you're not going to be as penalized walking through the open world. So you're probably going to enjoy doing all the open world stuff that much more. Low item quality items are just going to drop as materials as opposed to dropping as themselves, cluttering everything up. I'm going to have an entire video that covers on this, but basically this reduced the total amount of items I need to pick up and interact with by something like 33%, where I wouldn't have gained any value. I would have just manually dropped them on the floor, which playing on a controller absolutely sucked. So that's a pretty phenomenal change. You're going to see it high up in a lot of different lists. They're making XP just generally better across the board, with the things being multiplicative, increasing how much XP you get from monsters, increasing the fact that incense now gives you a bonus to XP and that those will actually stay on you through deaths. Now you just have more multipliers going the entire time. Just pound for pound, they said that on average, it's going to be 40% faster to reach level 100. And that's only looking at the XP bonuses. That has nothing to do with how much faster the game is going to be, with better mounts and better systems and more power on the character, etc. The Tree of Whispers has been dramatically overhauled to just be a much better experience for the character. You're going to get better gear from it. You're going to get stronger gear from it. You're going to get more of the gear that you want to get from it. It's going to drastically increase how much gold you get whenever you turn one in. So supposedly the Tree of Whispers is going to be one of the meta farming spots for gold accumulation, which is something that the developers have said. Obviously we'll have to see that later, but in general, Tree of Whispers is just significantly better as an overall system. They've increased item power to 920. It has a huge amount of implications. I have an entire other video talking about what this means, but in general, players are just a lot stronger and can tank much heavier amounts of damage unless they rebalance the other systems with this in mind. Cities have been overhauled. Stashes are going to be available next to like really important merchants. So like the blacksmith will have a stash and the occultist will have a stash. On top of that, the purveyor of curiosity is going to move over to waypoints, so you don't have to run as far to go get to them. There's going to be stashes in every single city that has a waypoint, so now you don't have to go all the way back to Kyovashad when you're like adventuring up in the Fractured Peaks, because there will be a stash there if you really want it, etc. They're reworking how much enchanting costs. It's just going to in general cost less overall as opposed to what it was previously, which is like super spiked and ramped, meaning you'll be able to re-roll items a lot more before you eventually have to give up if you never hit the stat that you want. Particular hardcore, the scroll of escape will now trigger if you are in combat and you DC from the game. So while some people will be able to abuse this in general, it's still consuming the scroll, so it's not like you just get away with doing it for free, but it just means that less completely garbage hardcore deaths are going to be caused by like server instability and that kind of thing. So overall, hardcore players are going to be able to rely on actually being able to survive if they've done everything correctly. They said in general they're reducing crowd control for monsters, which has been a big point of feedback. It's hard to say exactly what that means without seeing what the numbers look like. But if I'm just CC'd for less often, that's obviously going to impact how much fun I have and how the gameplay feels in general. World bosses and Legion events are going to happen significantly more often, where previously a world boss would take 6 hours to spawn. Now it's only going to take 3.5 hours to spawn. With us getting much better pings throughout the world for when these events are actually happening, being able to see them on our minimap a lot more easily, and getting a worldwide notification 15 minutes before the world boss goes up. So people are just going to be interacting with this system a lot more, being able to get the benefits from interacting with this system. And in general, especially while you're leveling, I think it's just fun to do Legion events and world boss events. So I'm a little bit biased here. I know a lot of people say like, it's not hard enough. Look, just being able to do them more often for your average 9-to-5 gamer dad with 17 kids who's just trying to get down with his wife and literally has no time to play this game means he gets to go get the world boss cosmetics more often. And that's pretty dope. Helltide is also getting a bit of an overhaul. You're going to be able to more specifically target farm for particular item types in the Helltide chests. They're going to be icons on the Helltide chests. They're increasing the XP boost. You're going to be able to farm them for the materials for the endgame bosses. So Helltide is just increased in value and has become easier to navigate and just more user friendly in general. You're going to be able to hide different things in combat text, like fortified status or anything else. You know, every single time that you just like massively apply vulnerable to an entire pack of monsters with Bone Spear, now you can hide that so you don't have to see it all the time. Just generally cleaning up the entirety of like the combat experience in the game. And I think this is probably one of like the most undersold changes that they made. It is really, really nice. You're gonna be able to zoom out further on the minimap. That's it. I think people wanted that. I agree. I think the minimap has been kind of useless. I don't really use the minimap altogether that much. I just kind of open my full map, but I'm still looking for an overlay map over the middle of my character. Blizzard, please give me back my overlay map. It's the only way that I can play these games. You're going to be able to filter the stash. I have another entire video about the stash filtering system and what we've seen thus far and what I think it could be better. But in general, just being able to filter for particular aspects that you want or particular stats on gear is probably good enough to get us going. But so stash filtering is kind of in its infancy right now, and I would like to see it get improved upon. But again, whole video on that. Go ahead and watch that one instead. You're going to be able to auto run. It's hard to say how much of an impact this will have, but like just in general, going through the open world or running to the next event in Helltide, or even just running down a long hallway in a dungeon, or if you're like a super giga chad, just running all the way through the Nightmare Dungeon on auto run seems generally cool. They're going to make it so that item affixes on pieces of gear when you're comparing them are just more consistent. Like the stats on the gear will be in the same places or easier to read. Hard to see because they didn't show us an example, but I'm imagining that like if two pieces of gear both add to strength, it will always be at the top, etc., regardless of the other stats that are there. This was kind of just like tucked into the notes, but apparently minions and companions will no longer attack invulnerable targets. I'll be honest with you, I didn't even know that they attacked invulnerable targets. But hey, minion builds are slightly better. This one is hyper specific, but since it's in the notes, I included it in the lists that I have here. Gems are now going to be a crafting material. They're no longer going to take up space in your inventory unless you craft one, in which case you'll have it in your inventory like you normally would. You'll be able to put it into a piece of gear, but they will drop as materials, meaning you don't have to pick them up. You don't have to try to avoid picking them up, especially on a controller, which is just impossible. This will free up space in your stash. It'll make it so that your inventory isn't super full of it. In a single dungeon run, picking up every single item, I picked up 8 gems, which I would need to have picked up to then pick up the more useful items underneath them. So bare minimum, like 8 less button clicks or even more than that per dungeon run seems like a pretty influential change. So that's why it's going to be a bit higher rated than you would typically expect it, but it really touches on so many different game systems to not have to touch these things anymore. Items can now be favorited, just like they can be junked, and a favorited item won't be sold or salvaged when you use one of those auto functions. I personally don't use the junk system, but I know that a lot of people do like using a junk system, and being able to do this instead will probably save some headache. So that's why it's going to actually make its appearance in some of these lists. And then we're just going to have 2 more character slots. That's it. Just 2 more character slots. Now you can have 2 more mules. You know, at the very least, this means that you don't have to go through and delete anything to start playing this season. You'll probably have to delete at least one thing to continue playing it, but still, 2 more seems pretty good. Alrighty, so that was obviously huge. I want to kind of chop up this video into a lot of different parts. Maybe that's what I'll end up doing. So if you see this at the end of every single video, that's why it happened. But maybe I just leave it all together for the people who like to watch super long breakdowns of everything. But I really hope that this went a long way to be able to contextualize all of the different changes and how they rank up in their overall impact on how you potentially will be experiencing the game of Diablo 4. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.